All right, we have with us Dr. Gail Christopher. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a while in the process. I've been communicating with Mia Mathis, and she's been very helpful in this. So thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Now, I wanted to speak to you about this project that you started, Racial Healing. What can you tell us about that?
Well, thank you for that question. I have to, give credit to the people who preceded me in efforts that were called the healing of racism. There have been many efforts to do that. They're kind of similar to anti-racism efforts. My focus, which I call RX or prescription racial healing, is I don't consider it anti-racism as much as I consider it pro understanding our interdependence and interconnected dynamic as one human family. I'm very much inspired by Buckminster Fuller, the 20th century architect, who says that, we don't change things. Change doesn't happen by attacking existing models. Change happens when we create new models that make the old models obsolete. And so in the RX racial healing work, we're really modeling a new model, a new way of relating to one another, of developing the skills and capacities that we need to be able to see ourselves reflected in the eyes or the face of the perceived other, to really do away with this antiquated fallacy of a hierarchy of human value that's been used to divide us, to oppress, to brutalize, to do all manner of things that are anathema to the basic human need to honor one another and to connect with one another.
I love how you bring up anti-racism. So the way I see it, I understand that there's kind of multiculturalism, there's anti-racism, and now there's what you're prescribing here is this RX racial healing. What's the difference between those three? Can you elaborate?
Well, and you could add to that cultural diversity or diversity, right, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, what we may be talking about is a continuum. I know my work in this field began 40 years ago with multicultural education.
Right.
Multicultural education followed the movement of cultural competence in the sense of it was trying to say to the dominant culture, the white dominant culture, to honor and respect the various differences in life experience of many diverse groups. And some of that early work was around curriculum development. It was also around when we started as a country, the United States started doing a lot more shifting and shipping of people to other countries. The idea of multiculturalism had its roots in corporate America, preparing its people to interface effectively within diverse cultures. Because, we didn't want to fall into the trap of the ugly American that assumed that our way was the right way. And so there was a real movement, a real push to get people to know how to interact within diverse cultures, to respect the cultures of the local people. So that's part of the whole multicultural concept. Here in this country, it involved revisiting the history and experiences of diverse people. Got a lot of pushback from academia and the hierarchy, but that was a movement. The anti-racism movement really, I think, happened sort of around the same time. It really tried to make people more aware of the atrocities and the cruelties and the inhumane treatment of indigenous people, the enslavement of Africans in this country, and the decades, centuries-long denial of the humanity because of racism. And the idea was to heighten awareness of racism and its many, many iterations and forms, and to get people to disavow racism. And that movement has really reemerged now as a major mantra, if you will, of the protest against the recent brutal killing of George Floyd. And there's a couple of books that are pushing the anti-racism frame, all of which is good. I'm not negating the value of any of it, but I do see it as a continuum. The other area that has gained a lot of traction since the civil rights era is what they call cultural diversity and inclusion work, or diversity, equity, and inclusion work, DEI. Again, an attempt to sort of broaden and expand and include others who have been historically excluded. My work is grounded in what I consider the undergirding belief system or premise that allows for this exclusion and this oppression. I think that our belief systems drive our behaviors, our belief drives our decision-making. And so even though we've dealt with the consequences and the effects of racism, we've never really eradicated racism itself, the permission, the fundamental belief that allows us to devalue people. And so I focus in this work on changing people's consciousness and understanding and our ability to relate with one another. And this can happen in many ways. Sometimes this shift occurs through marriage, interracial marriage. Sometimes the shift occurs because you have a teacher or a counselor or a doctor or a physician, or someone interacts through their work with diverse people, and they realize this is ridiculous. We are 99.9% the same. Why are we treating each other this way? So there are many routes to this shift in consciousness. The methodology that I have developed, informed by the research of many people, is a way to intentionally accelerate a mass shift in consciousness in terms of our capacity to relate with one another. I believe it's important that we focus on what we're for, what we're creating, that we focus on the desired state. I think we have to go through and beyond the perpetrator-victim dichotomy and get to a co-creating dynamic that is shared by everyone.
Yes, I like that. Oh, thank you. Because I was reading Ibram Kendi's work, who is an anti-racist. Like that's the work that he focuses on. And he's talking about how there is no kind of objective truth. It's just a bunch of subjective truths piled on together. And the strongest one is what kind of prevails. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Well, I think that gets a little esoteric. I believe that there is a foundational truth of our humanity. I believe that the science of the genome does tell us that we are basically all, 99.9% the same, and we trace our lineage, all of us, back to what the geneticists call mitochondrial Eve, which was a woman in Africa. And I believe there is truth to that. When I talk about the truth, I'm talking about that truth in terms of the opposite of the position or the positing of a racial hierarchy taxonomy that was created. And Ibram Kendi's first book, which is stamped from the beginning, a book award, National Book Award winning book, really a good historical recounting of the root of the ideas of racism and racial hierarchy. So I guess one could say that each person has their own truth, but the human body has a way of, for me, serving as the truth, and the science that's associated with that. So I'm very concerned with getting us to honor that and to have compassion for ourselves and to extend that compassion to others, to develop the capacity of empathy or for empathy, to develop, and we can't extend compassion to others if we don't have it for ourselves. So we have to develop that understanding and make that a principle upon which we build our democracy. And democracy, we're young, we're relatively new at this effort, but you do need a lot of people who will value each other and will be willing to make necessary decisions that demonstrate that value. And we haven't quite gotten there as a country in America. Now, we have a national effort that is in play now, which we call Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. It sort of creates it embraces the idea of racial healing, but it also acknowledges that we need to look at the past, we need to heal from it, and then we need to build new systems of opportunity in this country that are not based on the historic fallacy of racial hierarchy. And so Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation is our adaptation of the Truth and Reconciliation model that Canada implemented for Indigenous people, that were taken from the children were taken and put into boarding schools. We read that report. We were very inspired by it because it looked at historic wrong. We also looked at Australia, the way they dealt with some effort toward truth and reconciliation and apologies to the Aboriginal people. Most of the truth and reconciliation efforts around the world have been about transitional governance and transitional justice following a major conflict. We can't be as informed by those models because ours is a historic continuum, if you will, based on a belief system that's embedded in our laws and our systems and our economy. So we designed the TRHT, or Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, to deal with that historic challenge. It has 5 basic components. The first one is narrative change. You know that our brains are wired for story. We remember stories, we believe stories. Stories kind of shape our human experience. And so we know it's a big part of this work is telling a different story about who we are and how we became who we are. And then it's about racial healing. It's about bringing diverse people together to build the skills and the capacities to extend compassion and love and genuine caring for one another. Then we have to ask ourselves, well, how, if this is a fallacy, how has it been sustained for all these centuries? And we came up with 3 basic systems for that. Right. One is through separation, the other is through our legal system, and the final is through our economy. And so those are the 5 components of the TRHT framework: narrative change, racial healing, dealing with separation, the law, and the economy. And we have communities and organizations and college campuses all across this country that are adapting that framework to their needs within their local communities. And we hope all that will continue to expand and ultimately connect with a national effort that will be authorized by the government.
Well, it just makes so much sense, but for whatever reason, people have been othering people as long as history has gone on. And this is the next step, as you say, it's an evolution in our understanding. And earlier you said that if you have a relationship with somebody, it's hard to kind of other them. And that's really what it kind of comes down to, is having these conversations. And on your website, I saw that a big part of this was just having a group of people speaking with one another and finding that we are more alike than we are different.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. We call them racial healing circles.
Right.
And the circles are very carefully designed and co-facilitated. So when we're training people to co-facilitate these circles, we make sure they understand that this is not a, in quote, conversation about race, right?
Right.
Because that tends to take us in another direction.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
These are actual experiences. You have to allow a few hours for it. You also have to pre-plan it so that the people in the circle are very diverse from one another. Right. And that's a gift, because we live in very segregated times still, right? And so we can go through our whole lives and never interact with Indigenous people, right, or immigrant families or refugee families or African-American or white families. I mean, we have to really be intentional, or Latino families. And so when people plan these racial healing circles, a big part of the work is in the pre-work in terms of getting the right people into the room. Now that we live in a virtual world where COVID-19 sort of interferes with our coming together in person, we're adapting this methodology into the virtual space. And it may actually allow us to do even more because we can bring more diverse people together internationally, nationally. So we're experimenting with that, and we're figuring out how that is. But people do come together, and then they're guided through and given the opportunity to share authentic stories or narratives of their own life in pairs, in dyads, so they feel safe and they feel comfortable doing it. And the sharing is prompted by questions that they're answering. And those questions have been designed to elicit examples of the meeting of basic human needs for self-expression. And because of that, you've got this opportunity to be with people who are different. You've got this invitation to share narratives that are authentic, but they are centered around our common humanity.
Right.
And if the room is diverse, what you end up having is 70% of those narratives have to do with the experiences of discrimination and racism, because it is so ubiquitous. And so when you hear it over and over and over again in many different iterations, you come out of that, because after they share in dyads, they also share in the larger original circle. You come out of it having just having challenged, your own stories, if you will, your own narrative about humanity. And we found it's a very powerful way to help people to move along the journey. And we're all on a journey. Nobody's got this right. We all are biased.
Well, and you bring up this kind of schism that's happening, that we can just be in this camp and never interact with this other camp. And I do see that kind of politically happening quite with the left and the right. And really, if we just were able to sit down and be able to have a conversation about our basic human needs, we might see, okay, you know what, that person isn't what I think that they are, this way out there left or this way out there right, whatever it may be. But if we were just able to have these conversations talking about our needs and what we hope to get out of our lives, we might have a much healthier conversation. And I think that that's a great point of it, is how there's a health aspect to this, and how you treat others is a true reflection of how you treat yourself.
No question. You said it beautifully, Robert. It is absolutely true. There is a manipulation game that happens when we're talking politics and power, or perceived power. And so these extreme conversations, one extreme or the other, they're used to arouse emotion, to mobilize people out of fear. But most of us know living in that state creates unnecessary stress.
Yes.
We just want to live our lives, raise our families, experience some degree of love and comfort and security, and have an environment, a country, a democracy that supports all of that. So we have to be mindful, not, I think, to buy into either extreme.
Mm-hmm.
And this work is designed to expand the middle, so that the two extremes,
thank you,
smaller.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Well, that's what kind of started me on this road, if you will, is that I was looking, and I'm only really hearing two very loud voices, and I know that there's a voice in the middle, and that's where I want to go, right?
Yeah. I like that you said, because I think the other thing that this work reminds us of is that there are different ways of knowing.
Right.
There is knowing because you read it somewhere, but there's also an inner knowing. There's an inner sense of what feels right, and that leaves you calm and motivated and at peace. And you sound like you listen to that inner knowing, that inner voice that tells you, oh, this doesn't feel right, So
right.
I think we have to lift that up.
Well, and any way that I can help in doing that, please let me know. And that's what even brought me to you is this investigation. And well, I don't know if investigation is the right word, but trying to understand, right?
Okay. Uh-huh.
And when I'm talking with people, because I work as a registered clinical counselor,
Yep.
oftentimes you can get into conflict with people because they're trying to figure something out. But when you tell them that you have the same goal as they do, that's when things start to come together. Like with parents, they'll think that the school is against them. And then I say to them, we want the same thing. We want what's best for your child, just like you do. And that's when they realize, okay, we don't need to work in conflict with each other. We can work cooperatively. And that's, and that's when things start to go in the right direction. But when we're just butting heads, it's like, are we trying to win this argument, or what's the goal here?
And there's no greater love, I don't think, than the love of a parent for a child. And, when I started this work, I was vice president at the Kellogg. Well, when I crystallized it, I started the work 40 years ago. But when I had the resources, the privilege to direct resources to support the work, I was at the Kellogg Foundation. And it's one of the largest philanthropies in the world. But our mission was to help vulnerable children thrive. And we recognized that this issue of othering, this issue of racial hierarchy and human value hierarchy, it was a systemic, structural, real barrier to the health and well-being of our nation's children. And if we were going to fulfill our mission, we needed to do everything we could as smartly and efficiently as we could to help eradicate this barrier, so children have an equal opportunity to succeed and to thrive.
What made you said 40 years ago, like what brought you into this work?
Well, the truth of the matter is, I am a licensed holistic health practitioner, a doctor of naturopathy and naturopathy with a specialty in clinical nutrition. But I was led to that work by the loss of my firstborn child. My daughter died when she was 3 months old, and it just catapulted me into a journey to try to understand, why did this happen? I discovered this epidemic of infant mortality disproportionately among African-American women. And so I devoted my early career to trying to help to prevent needless death of both mothers and babies. And that just sort of walked me into a deeper understanding of racism and its effects. And that was the catalyst. In fact, the center that I've developed here in Maryland, it's called the Ntianu Center for Healing in Nature. And it's named in memory of that daughter, because, if you lose a child, you never get over that. That's just unnatural. And so that's what guided me into the work. But I kept and then, there was the whole social determinants of health movement that said, what really shapes health is not what happens in the doctor's office after you get sick, but what are the conditions in which you live, which either predispose you to become ill or help you prevent illness, right? From the food to the air, to the stress from the economics or poverty, all these things combined. Are you educated? We know that education makes a huge difference in terms of life expectancy and health. And so we have that movement globally, and the United States ultimately, it took us a while, but we embraced the social determinants framework. But here, the driver, the hidden shaper, if you will, the hidden weaver of the web of social determinants is this idea of racism, of human value hierarchy. And so you can keep patching, the holes, but if you don't pull that thread, ultimately, that is weaving this cloth that leads to illness, you're going to keep having to do the same thing. So, people talk about going upstream and dealing with the root causes. I have discovered personally that this idea of racism, both internalized and externalized and projected, it's a root cause of illness. Well,
I think too that for me, the dominant culture in Canada is white, right? So I don't know what it's like to be, or growing up, I didn't know what it was like to be the other until I went on a trip with my friend to Barbados. And I was the only, white person there. I was the other. Now, my experiences were very positive, but it made me think, okay, now if I was living in a different society and I was trying to make ends meet, I was working there, I was raising my family there, and that's where I was all the time. The feeling of being different, and you would be treated different because not everybody, like you say, is educated, is working towards understanding the humanity of others. Those experiences would weigh heavily on you and would be stressful. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard for someone like myself, who is a member of the dominant culture, to kind of really understand that without, like you say, having these conversations.
And what you really emphasized just now, Robert, was the experience. It wasn't just a conversation. And I like to frame the racial healing circle as an experience, because you are, in a room with all these different people for a while. You're deftly facilitated and guided so that the conversation, the rule of this work is do no harm, So the dignity and the value of every person having the experience, we make every effort to honor that. Right. But we do need these immersive experiences in order to challenge ourselves. I mean, I didn't know anything about the indigenous Native American experience, although truthfully it's part of my heritage, although I didn't know that. Or the experience of Latinx immigrants, or Asian American Pacific Islanders or Native Hawaiians. I didn't have that growing up until I had a chance to visit some of those cultures and experience a day or two or three and develop friendships and relationships with diverse people and read about their culture and their history. All of these things opened my eyes and made me less inclined to act on my own biases. And that's the work I think that we have to do on an interpersonal level, but I don't want people to think this is just interpersonal. I mean, we then have to develop the critical mass of public will to change policies and structures and resource distribution patterns that perpetuate injustice. We have built so much of our taxation system, our school funding system, simply our access to opportunity has been driven by this belief that some people deserve more than others, and we're going to maintain that hierarchy. And so we've got a lot of work to do to not only repair and compensate for the damage, the unpaid labor, the land that was taken. We also have to design new systems of opportunity that ultimately I think are going to make us a stronger country.
Well, I was talking with an economist, and he was sharing how, and this is so obvious, but it's not about cultures or any specific place a person's from. It's their opportunities that create their environment. So he was talking about in Europe, there was a country of immigrants, and they looked at recidivism, or their likelihood of repeating a crime, going back to prison. And he said that if there's jobs, the likelihood of reoffending is so much lower than if they don't have jobs. Therefore, saying that if you have opportunities, you're less inclined to commit crime, right? So whereas we say things like, oh, well, that's what's happening in that culture or something. But then you need to look at, are they given the same opportunities as the dominant culture? Yeah. Usually the answer is no, right?
The answer is no, and bear in mind that here in the United States, we incarcerate more people than any other country. Right. We have built an economic industry on incarceration.
Right.
And then we have created all manner of barriers post-incarceration so that the person who, after they, quote, have paid their debt to society, they don't have the opportunity structures to reintegrate into society. Well, I worked on that issue a lot in my career, and we still haven't made the progress, although we've made some, but there have been a lot of people championing that cause because of the racial disparities associated with that prison industrial complex.
Yeah.
You've got overwhelmingly Black and brown people caught up in that system and therefore more vulnerable. And we saw that a lot of the deaths due to COVID-19, the disparities, have been associated with people being in those systems where they were just literally incubators, if you will, for the pathology, for the virus. So we've got a lot of work to do,
Yeah.
but I remain optimistic and hopeful and inspired by people like yourself who are willing to take this journey. And hopefully the work will accelerate over the next few years and we'll build back better, as they say, after
Right.
this pandemic, these simultaneous pandemics of economic uncertainty, the exposure of racial injustice, and the virulence of this virus, COVID-19.
Well, I love what you said about how it's not just about destroying the house. It's not just about putting up new paint, but it's about looking at the structure and re-strengthening it, retooling it,
Yeah.
and finding ways that we can work, together to get to where we need to be. Because the reality is that equity, it's going to make us all so much healthier, I think.
Yep.
Right.
Well, it's going to make our economy healthier.
Yeah.
And that's going to make us healthier. And us being healthier is going to stop the drain on our economy, the lion's share of which is chronic disease. So it is a circular investment that people have to recognize, but I think we will. And Robert, I've been honored to have been invited to be part of your effort in terms of your podcast.
Thank
As you know, I've got to get ready to get on another call, but
okay. Last question for you. In your pursuits, how do you stay positive? What do you do to stay positive?
Well, I have a 2-year-old grandson.
Okay.
And he lights up my life. I look at him and every cell in my body just comes to life, and I smile, and I realize that the work I'm doing is helping to assure that he has equal opportunity, as he grows. I'm also a deeply, I believe, spiritual person. And I believe that we have within us the creative ability to generate goodness and love. And I have had that experience in my lifetime. And I've never, ever felt abandoned in that sense. I believe I'm always connected to and with the creative power of the universe. And I just know that, and I affirm that. Nature is a very strong healing force, and I get out into nature a few times every day. I live near a forest. A forest is part of my center here. And so I respect and receive the energy from the forest and from the trees. And that helps to center me and make me a more effective person, I think.
Awesome. You're spiritually resilient, and I'm picking that up. So thank you so much, Dr. Gail Christopher. And keep in touch, and have a wonderful day.
You do the same, and good luck with your podcast. I look forward to listening to it. Thank you.
Take care.